heavens with her. And you know what? She realized maybe it's not Charles, but he's a good guy and we've got a good home. And she needed a little bit more. She needed a little bit more fire to her religion because this was the most important thing in Lori's life. So she started a podcast. This podcast was on the Preparing a People network, and it was hosted by Lori and her best friend, a woman named Melanie Gibb. This is a spiritual extremism podcast. That is straight up what it is. If I can just chime in here for a minute with my Christian roots, which I do all the time, I talk about a lot of cases with female killers and religious killers, okay? That is just what I do. In this podcast, they talk a lot about concepts that don't seem very godlike to me. They talk about evil energy. They talk about spiritual prisons. They're using a lot of terminology that actually strikes me as pretty new agey. We have gone past reading the scripture, okay? Look, God said, go to heaven, read the Bible, be a good person. They started bleeding in this delusion, this religious extremism, these new age concepts. And to me, honestly, a lot of new age concepts are based in overcoming trauma and having this energetic kind of past that is still haunting you. And the problem is, in religion, we just don't respect mental health. It is actually shocking to me that they even 5150'd Lori at some point, because in extreme religious communities, we're like, oh, she's just praising God and it's okay. The things that Lori was saying on this podcast, honestly, to me, are not even godlike. But the question is, why are they doing this? Why are they diving into
Visit Raven 734's KO5 page at https://ko-fi.com/Raven 734 Twitch.
To witness that is not in that world, but the reason why people cling on to delusion is because it feels good. So when Lori is doing all of this, honestly, not even Mormon, very new age babble under the guise of, being a Latter-day Saint and being more spiritually connected. First of all, she's absolutely lost it. Second of all, this was a really scary podcast for some people to listen to. Her husband, Charles Vallow, after being married to her for 19 years, was like, I cannot even listen to this because I'm a little creeped out. When Lori was running around the house saying random delusional stuff, like how Tylee would comment on it or on how Charles would comment on it, because everybody else in the room wasn't down with her delusions, it kind of stayed caged. She might say something and then go off into La La Land or whatever. Now she has created an echo chamber for her delusions with a weekly schedule and other participants. So this means the delusion is going to grow. They are fanning the flames, and every week they're sitting down in this podcast, feeling important, feeling enlightened, feeling closer to God, and feeling like they are doing the Lord's work. But in reality, we are a commune of people bonded together by delusion and spiritual fanaticism. That's what it is. This podcast is a pivotal moment in her life, okay? Because we have gone from her saying a few things in church and people being like, okay, Lori, to her saying a few things in the home and people being like, okay, Lori.
Alrighty, everybody.
Now,
thank you so much for waiting while I took a break.
I listened to this podcast.
Got some much needed sustenance.
What was probably the most shocking part about it, other than the spiritual demons conversation.
So let's get back to the drawing.
Wherever they were reporting, this person had multiple pets, a bird, and a dog. And through the entire podcast, while Lori is just me, you just hear this parrot and this bird just going on and on and on in the background. Can y'all imagine if I was doing Sinister and I had a bird right here, a dog right here, and a really energetic cat over here, and I just kept talking and you were supposed to listen? That's what their podcast was like. So, to do an audio show with the dog and the parrot going off in the background, are you enlightened? Are you? Now, you remember, I told you this podcast was on the Preparing a People network, which, by the way, terrifying name to me. I come from Christianity, and preparing a people, that don't sound Christ-like to me. Because you know what? You are not supposed to assemble the mission yourself, okay? You are supposed to wait for God. Y'all are supposed to wait this is like a Spartan warrior that is getting ready to fight for God. God didn't ask you to go to war. He didn't ask you to go to war. And they are out here, spiritual warriors. You know what this is giving? This is giving people that are extremely traumatized, but they're not allowed to acknowledge their trauma because maybe the trauma came from the church, or the church doesn't believe in trauma or mental health. So they have to rationalize it with these new age concepts like spiritual demons rather
No,
than
we don't do that.
this person's a fucking narcissist.
We actually
Okay,
provide
their
therapy,
podcast
like with
is
real
this weird
therapists.
combination
And I
of
know that
mental health that nobody's allowed to talk about.
I know
using
that
new age
usually
terms, and
therapists
religion.
through the
I think
church
they're
are
really talking about their
not the
mental
best,
health
but these are
issues,
like
but they
actual
can't do
therapists,
it,
like
so
that have
they
their
do
own
it under
clinics
the
and
guise of
stuff.
religion, and it ends up
Not
turning into
like
the
it's
craziest
not some
podcast
teacher
you've
from
ever
the
heard.
from
So you remember I said that this was on the Preparing a People
that could just
Network. Well,
talk
guess
to
what?
you.
It's time for the Preparing
People
a
with
People
actual degrees
Conference,
in
and that
mental
is
health
exactly
therapy
where
and all that
Lori
stuff.
and her friends go to find fellow spiritual warriors that are also fans of their podcast and connect with God. So, in 2018, Lori goes to the convention with her friend Melanie. On one of the days, she ends up going to a panel where this guy was speaking. He was an author. He wrote apocalyptic religious military novels. Now, he wasn't a New York Times bestseller, but he was on stage and everyone was listening. He introduced himself and his name was Chad Daybell. And Chad was up there talking about his books, talking about his beliefs, and talking about everything.
Ooh, wrist is
And
getting
there's
tight.
a moment where Lori's listening to this guy, and I can only imagine him talking just slowly turn into wah, 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 because Lori's eyes lit up. This was her man. This was her God warrior. Oh my God, he's here. He has finally been sent. Now remember, Lori has been married 4 times. She is not afraid of divorce, and she's not afraid of love. And with Chad Daybell, it was practically love at first sight. Lori went up and introduced herself right away to Chad. Now, if you're listening on audio, you may not know what Chad and Lori look like. I implore you to look it up. But let me give you a little bit of a description. Chad Daybell is a frumpy man with an interesting head shape. That's the best way I can describe it. It's like his head shape is like a rectangle inside of a rectangle inside of a rectangle. He has the most textbook military buzz cut I've ever seen in my life. Like, even the length that I'm looking at in this photo, I'm like, holy shit, that's a military buzz cut. He's got nice teeth. Other than that, he kind of just looks like a sad pastor. He's giving sad pastor vibes. Or, you know what? He dresses like a pastor, but he doesn't have the conviction in him to be a pastor. I'm actually seeing more like Usher here, maybe Usher, okay? And then Lori, disclaimer, she's a fucking monster, but she's a pretty woman. So I'm gonna use that description because I'm making a point here. Lori is an older woman that takes really good care of herself, okay? Most people in California or Utah, they would look at her and say, that is a very pretty lady. She's got blonde hair that's dyed pretty well, touched up, it's got nice layers in it, she's got pretty teeth, she's got a little shimmery pink lipstick on, she's got blue eyes, a little mascara, all of her facial features are all in the right place, got a little Botox, a little something done, but Lori's taking care of herself. I'm gonna make some assumptions here, but walk with me. So when these two people meet at the Preparing a People conference, Lori is going into it like, oh, I like you. And Chad is looking at her like, are you talking to me? This man can't believe this pretty woman is talking to him, okay? And this is really, really, really important. I know here, I don't want to call a murderer pretty. I don't want to call a child killer pretty. But I have to, for the context of the story, because I think it plays a major role into it. People at the conference said, including Lori's best friend Melanie, that she was flirting with Chad. When she walked up, she was not just inquiring about the book, she was flirting. And Chad, he's actually married. But also, you want to talk to me right now? Just, oh my gosh, tell me more about your book. I want to know more. And he's like, well, yeah. So what is Chad going to do in this moment? He's going to put it on. He's going to put on the confidence, you know? This woman has approached him. She's clearly interested. He's down. He almost can't even believe this this is happening? This doesn't sound very Christ-like to me. This doesn't sound like a religious conference when two married people are walking up to each other trying to figure out what each other's genitals look like. That's not very Christ-like to me. Also, Spotify listeners, nothing has changed. Rate the podcast 5 stars. But if you're watching on YouTube, yes, this is day 2. I had to turn the lights on for my own sanity. It was very spooky in the beginning. I hope it felt spooky. Okay, so before we get to these two adulterers, who is Chad Daybell? And more specifically, who is Chad Guy Daybell? That's right. His full legal name is Chad Guy Daybell. This is particularly funny because in American culture, the names Chad and Guy are used interchangeably to describe a kind of douchey jock guy. And that is exactly the opposite of who Chad was. In this case, I stumbled on this news article that was from a very reputable source, and it says, from an early age, Chad was into apocalyptic thinking. Many of his writings were fixated on the idea of life and death. And I thought this was really interesting because I don't think most children are just born into the world like, when will I die? I must write about this. To me, if a child is obsessed with life and death, there's some type of influence. A pretty rational explanation for a child constantly thinking of this is, okay, well, they were raised in the church and there's heaven and hell. Okay, there we go. Life and death, good and bad, good and evil, blah, blah, blah. Maybe this kid was just really into it. But this is what I thought was really interesting. I generally put my opinions at the end, but I'm going to insert my thoughts on it here while also telling you exactly what happened. Here are some details from Chad's childhood. 1, when he was in 4th grade, he wrote a novel, and it was called The Murder of Dr. J and his assistant. This story was about somebody younger killing an older man. His teacher said that it was a fun but gruesome story, and they praised his creativity. So from an early age, and I mean 4th grade, Chad was writing stories about killing older men. In his memoir, which Chad actually has a memoir, by the way, he talks about this one story. And it's a story where he was so mad at the world one day that he started killing bees. Here's a quote from his book. I spotted another one, then another one. I got a strange satisfaction from it. I kept count. And after half an hour, I had killed 120 bees. But he said he stopped when he heard a voice. And this voice whispers and shouts instructions in his ear. Sometimes very specific militaristic instructions, commands. And he calls it a voice. Okay, I'm not going to insert too much of my opinion here. I'm going to take those facts and hand them to you. And I want you to
cannot get
tell
the
me
angle
what
right
you think.
here.
Chad grew up in the church ever since he was a little boy. And from a young age, he started writing stories about killing older men. And then he starts killing animals. I'm sorry, a bee is essentially, if you are killing bees and you're killing 120 bees, you basically are killing animals. That is an animal killer trick, okay? So my question is, what is Chad so mad about, and what happened to Chad Daybell? Once again, this story as a whole, we are talking about child killers. They are people that killed children. That is what Lori and Chad are. But my job here is to dig into the past and figure out what makes a child killer. And so I leave the ball in your court on that. Personally, I think something happened to Chad that he never dealt with, and everyone either minimized or told him it didn't happen, and he created a lot of internalized anger and rage, and that is who he is. So through school, after the 4th grade, Chad writes more and more stories, and he ends up getting compliments on a regular basis about his writing. So he goes to school for journalism. While he's attending Brigham Young University, he ends up meeting his wife, Tammy. Tammy, named Tammy Douglas, they said that she caught his eye immediately. Bro, Tammy is a little cutie, a little baddie, okay? There's actually quite a few pictures of them when they were younger, and Chad, you know what? Chad actually looked like he was quite enamored with Tammy, and she was definitely in love with him. In her younger pictures, and then her most up-to-date pictures, there was one trait about Tammy that is always consistent and very adorable, and it's her smile. She had this very cute, like, just very sweet. I don't know how to explain it, but it's almost like her whole personality was right there in that smile. And I've seen people like this before, and Tammy was one of them. She just looks like she's Misfix it, let's do it, let's put a smile on her face, let's go. She just has this really sweet energy in every single one of her photos. Chad and Tammy were actually perfect for each other because not only were they studious and religious, but also they both had a little bit of a dark side. After graduating, Chad went on his mission. Afterwards, he came home and he got a job as a graveyard digger and a cemetery sexton, which basically means he runs the cemetery. He went on a religious mission with his church and then right afterwards came home and started working in a graveyard. This is okay, but there's a darkness to it. If a girl that you know has been alt for most of her life and then she has to go on this trip with her church when she's 18 and she comes back and works in a graveyard, weirdly normal, I get it.
Oh,
But
husband's
for
home.
Chad Daybell, a guy
Let me go
who
say
was
hello to
like,
him.
I'm religious, I'm a religious man, I'm reporting to the church, da-da-da-da. Working a job in a graveyard is a little dark. And Tammy actually worked a job in the works department and she would deliver burial reports to
completely
so Chad and Tammy were a husband and wife couple that were working together in the graveyard. I think that is just so interesting for people with these strong religious backgrounds. Like, sure, the church needs a gravedigger, but he wasn't doing this for the church. He went to a cemetery and wanted to be around dead people. To wrap all of this up in a bow, if you're thinking, okay, they worked in a cemetery together, who cares? Or, oh, she was working in another department that just had to deliver stuff to the cemetery, who cares? You're reading too much into it. Okay, well, get this. They took their engagement photos in the cemetery. These two liked a little bit of darkness, and Chad certainly did. But they continue on to live a normal life, and they end up having 5 children. Tammy is kind of a, stay-at-home mom and a homemaker, but she eventually gets a job as a computer teacher. She was very forward-thinking, very, very smart, and